Joining us, MS Now senior legal reporter Lisa Rubin, New York Times White House correspondent Maggie Haberman. She is the author of the mega best-selling book, Regime Change, which is still selling because it is so good. Inside the imperial presidency of Donald Trump, Maggie Haberman joins us, creator of The Circus and former advisor to George W. Bush and John McCain, Mark McKinnon, and ProPublica reporter Jen Fifield. All right. Let's talk about mail-in voting. So why is Donald Trump so obsessed with stopping mail-in voting when he himself mails his vote and when so many Republicans mail in their votes? For a long time, even when he started doing this, Republicans were the majority in who sent mail-in ballots, especially in a place like Florida, especially in a place like Arizona.
There was a lot of effort put in by Republican leaders in 2020 to get Trump to stop saying that mail-in ballots were corrupt for the reason you just said. It was COVID. There were clearly going to be changes. Now, Republicans didn't try to expand it legislatively in the states the way the Democrats did. But they also knew that a lot of their voters are older and they rely on this voting. So why does he do it? Because I don't know that he's ever had much of a problem saying one thing and doing another. The reason that I think that he is so focused on this, just as a concept, it primarily relates, yes, it will obviously impact this upcoming midterm. But in his mind, this is primarily about showing he was right about 2020. That is what all of our reporting shows.
But isn't it kind of one of the reasons why he lost in 2020? Because he suppressed the vote? Isn't there an argument out there that his campaign against mail-in balloting worked against him in key places like Arizona?
There is an argument to that effect, and a lot of his own advisors have made it, and including for what I was just saying about how their own base votes this way, this older, whiter voter base. There's also the argument that there was a general competence question on the ballot in 2020 about COVID, and that is some of what is on the ballot now, too. So if he is attempting to recreate aspects of this argument from 6 years ago, he is doing it.
So it's counterproductive. So here's the other question. Is it strategic? Or if Donald Trump is so against mail-in voting, is he trying to find an alternative way to get at it legally? Does he believe that, I'm kind of lost in my question here, but he's appealing to the Supreme Court regarding mail-in voting. He's also appealing to the Supreme Court eventually on voter rolls.
The question of voter rolls, I think, is really a baffling one. And I think it's more about situating a narrative about the upcoming election as well as relitigating the 2020 election more than it is actually about winning a legal case. As you noted, 23 states have won their litigation against the Department of Justice with respect to its demand for voter rolls because there is no legal predicate for their demand to obtain a state's voter roll. If and when they take this to the Supreme Court, and they were just denied an effort to rehear in the Sixth Circuit, one of the federal appeals courts that has already heard one of these cases, my guess is that the Supreme Court will come down the same way as every other federal court that has made an actual determination on the merits here, Katie. But again,
so why does he keep appealing it?
Because he wants to say to people, we wanted the voter rolls and we couldn't get them. And if we had had them, we could have ensured that this election was safe and secure. And without it, this election is a widespread fraud. So it's all a perception thing. It's all,
I'm going to tell the electorate that it was fake and that everybody ensured it was fake and it was rigged. And I'm trying to fight for it to be secure and I can't help it.
That's part of it, but it's also the fact that we've seen this other times with him, especially with the Supreme Court. Birthright citizenship would be another one. So they did not win at the Supreme Court, although the ruling was a little closer than people expected it might be. So instead what you have is these two executive orders that he signed recently, one of which really just reiterates existing law, but the other could potentially create a different class of people who could not qualify for birthright citizenship. And that just raises the challenge again. And he is always going to keep trying to find other ways to do something, not only about perception. I think that is part of it, but also to see if they can be successful on a narrower sliver.
All right. So let's talk about the other moves that are being made right now about elections. Jen, you've been reporting on all of this. What are you watching?
Well, I just wanted to add there that the actual true purpose of obtaining these voter rolls, they're saying in court it's to clean the voter rolls, but we see them handing them over to the Department of Homeland Security, and we see internal communication at ProPublica showing that this is potentially violating Americans' privacy. So 16 states have already shared their voter rolls, and we know that they're coming up with these potentially inflated claims about non-citizens on the voter rolls that may be used to challenge election results. So I think that it is about 2020 and relitigating that election, but it also could be about the upcoming election and those results.
How would that work, Lisa? If they were trying to use inflated data about who's voting and who should not be voting from voter rolls that have already been submitted, how would it work in a lawsuit to refuse to certify or reject or refuse to seat a Democratic winner?
Well, I think both of those are possibilities, right? So in one instance, you have a refusal to certify, in which case the prevailing candidate would have to sue for certification. There's also the problem, and I think this is a scenario that you and I have talked about before, where the Speaker of the House refuses to allow the certification of the election on the congressional level. And then you've got a question of who sues Congress for failing to do its job in January. Both of those are increasingly likely scenarios, but the legal argument goes, we can't have trust in the election results. They shouldn't be certified, or if they are certified, we're going to continue to contest that on the ground that non-citizens were voting on a widespread basis. And what are they going to use to try and demonstrate that? They're going to conflate voter information in certain states with who is a citizen. As Jen's reporting showed, there were like hundreds, if not thousands, of false positive matches between people who were non-citizens in DHS's databases and people who were, in fact, registered to vote.
Jen, expand on that.
It's exactly right. There are databases being used that are known to produce matches for non-citizens where they actually are citizens. They've been kicked off the voter rolls in Texas. One Texas voter tried to vote in the primary election and couldn't because they had been removed from the voter rolls. And the Department of Justice is arguing that they are able to make these voter purges in the lead up to the midterm, which would typically be a quiet period. So they're still encouraging states to use these faulty databases to remove people, even though this is supposed to be a period in which voter registration is secure.
You write in the book about 2020 and the people that surround him all denying that he lost in 2020. I mean, that's a litmus test to get into this administration,
100%.
yes, but does he expect them to act on it if the Republicans lose in the midterms in a way that would change the results, ensure that he is not a loser again?
We don't have reporting on that. We're continuing to try to report on exactly what the efforts are here and the intentions are around the midterms. And I do want to say two things can be true at once. Donald Trump, in Donald Trump's mind, can be primarily about 2020 and proving he was right. And many people around him, and him to a lesser extent, can see this as an effort to try to impact what is coming in the fall. Multiple strands can happen here. Obviously, we can't rule anything out after January 6, 2021. I don't have special insight into what is coming. I do think that everything that we have seen is going to understandably raise questions about exactly what the intent is, what exactly is going to happen, not just with voter rolls, but also with, say, Steve Bannon keeps talking about ICE agents going to polling places, whether there will be some kind of other effort at curtailing voting.
Are you worried, Mark, about like a pre-effort as opposed to a post-effort? In 2020, it was a post-effort. He lost the election. Then he tried to overturn the results after that, refused to certify, et cetera, investigations. Are you worried about that? Or are you worried about them doing something beforehand, like, I don't know, sending ICE agents to the polls?
I'm worried about all of it. I mean, I think all of this, or predominantly, it's about trying to seed this notion ahead of time that there was fraud. So when it turns out badly, which I think Donald Trump, at least he has enough realistic perception about the environment to understand that's likely to happen. So he's doing everything in his power to seed the notion that there's something wrong with the election so that he can say so afterwards, and he will have already made the argument. By the way, let me just level set from my perspective here in Colorado. The notion that there's widespread voter fraud is the greatest fraud there is in American politics right now. It simply does not exist. There's no widespread voter fraud. There's barely any voter fraud at all. When it does happen, it's usually accidental, and it's just a handful of votes. Colorado, it probably does mail-in voting better than any other state. 98% of voters here vote by mail. Every single vote, not randomly, every single vote is checked by an FBI-trained analyst. Mail-in voting in Colorado is safer than in-person voting.
That's interesting. What about the idea, Mark, that Democrats need to win by such margins that it stops Donald Trump and his allies in their tracks? And I wonder what you think. Is that necessary, number one? Number two, is Donald Trump, are all these efforts to sow doubt, to claim fraud ahead of time, the threat of sending ICE agents or maybe declaring a national emergency or saying that certain people shouldn't be allowed to vote, does that create more incentive for people to get out there, more incentive for them to participate in a midterm election?
That's a great point, and I think that's exactly right, Katie. And I think that's the counterintuitive reality of this, is that the more noise Donald Trump makes about, sending monitors to watch the voter rolls, to analyze the voter rolls, take away the voter rolls, all that does is send Democrats a message that it's more important for them to get out and vote. So I think all that, in the end, all it does is it motivates Democratic voters to make sure that they overcome whatever obstacles that Donald Trump puts out there. South Carolina is a really good example. It was more about gerrymandering, but as soon as they started to do that and gerrymandered, one of the only black seats out of existence, there was such an uprising that the Republicans finally smartly figured out this is not going to work. This is the blowback on voter participation is going to blow us out of the water.